lecturers, members of Group 1, talking about a blast incident that took place in Lagos, January 2006. One of the examples of a blast case study for Nigeria is the Lagos explosion of 2006. On January 27, 2006, a gas tanker exploded in the Nigerian city of Lagos, causing a massive fire and widespread damage. The fire burned for days, and many people were exposed to toxic fumes from the fire. The explosion and the fire resulted in hundreds of deaths and injuries, and left many people homeless. In the aftermath of the explosion, there was a need for toxicological analysis to determine the extent of the damage and the risk of further exposure to toxic chemicals. This is the instance, and we are here to analyze on the first things to be done once an outbreak of such takes place. The first is the initial response, which is the most paramount activity that must be adhered to once a study like this, an event like this takes place. So, in this incident, the first people that were introduced, that were assembled into the scene, were the police and the fire department people, which are the people that came to investigate and to contain and to secure the environment, to prevent it from contamination, so as to pave way for forensic scientists to come in for analysis. Secondly, after which forensic scientists were introduced in order to document and collect every type of evidence as regards to the explosion. Once immediately those personnel arrived, the first thing they did was to take a photograph of the event and the interview of the people, the eyewitnesses that were there. Yes. And the next, I will now hand over the evaluation of the crime scene. To evaluate the explosion, forensic scientists uses a variety of methods. First, the determination of the size and the scope of the blast by looking at the damages caused to the building and other structures in the area. They also studied the blast patterns and the distribution of duties to determine where the explosion occurred and how it affects the surrounding area. In addition, they analyzed chemicals that were released in the explosion and their potential health effects. Finally, they looked at the injuries sustained by the people who were in the area at that time to determine the severity of the explosion. The information was then used to determine the case of the explosion. Documentation of the crime. Forensic scientists documented the explosion in several ways. First, they took photographs and videos of the site to record the damage caused by explosion. They also collected physical evidence from the site samples of soils, air, and water. In addition, they collected witnesses' statements from people who were in the area at the time of the explosion. Finally, they used computer modeling to stimulate blasts and determine the most likely cause of the explosion. This information was then compiled into a report that was used by law enforcement agency and others to better understand what happened and how to prevent similar incidents in the future. Processes of the evidence, processing the evidence. To process the evidence from the explosion, forensic scientists used a number of techniques. They examined the evidence under a microscope to look for a trace of chemical composition of the residue. They also use gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to analyze chemical composition of the residue. They also use X-ray, diffraction and other method of. They also use X-ray diffraction and other method to determine the debris that was collected. After that, we now go to completion and recording of the scene investigation. Forensic scientists follow guidelines and precautions to ensure all the investigative steps documented, and they ensure that the process is completed.
So the contribution from the member of the group.
I've exhausted
They are
everything.
finished. Anything? No. Okay, let me say one or two things concerning what you have said. You see, I didn't hear definition of crime scene.
Okay.
Was not there. I didn't see legal consideration. That is the law that guards, and there are some of these law. Fourth Amendment rights. That is that relates to U.S. Supreme Court. There is also establishment of crime scene law by Power and Responsibility Act. Then securing and management of scheme. All those ones, that means you didn't do enough research. Then evidence handling. Again, you gave an example of a blast that happened in Lagos. Where exactly? Ikorodu. Ikorodu has a name. It is the Federal Military Cantonment Exclusive Bombs, right? And it happened 2023 last year. There was another one, Lagos blast of 2020. In fact, March 15, 2020. You have to go to that and give us date of when the blast happened before you go on. So I'm taking out some money. You understand me back? Then, since it is a post blast, which is PBI, then there are some steps which you mentioned but not exclusive, like securing the scenes, documentation. When you lay more emphasis was on forensic examination. I love that. Forensic scientists collect samples, use IR, NMR for analyzing of the residues on the site. I love that. Then processing the blast scene. You understand that? So all this, you see, as a postgraduate student,